Hey, it's Mazzy, and there's nothing like dressing up for success, dressing up for a show, dressing up to go out at night. Of course, in rock and roll, basically you put on a t-shirt that you've been wearing for 3 days and you go out. It depends, but I thought for this video, I would just, spiff it up a little bit. These are 5 infamous shows I've seen in my lifetime. I'm going to go in order backwards from most recent to old. Now, I've been fortunate enough, and if you watch my channels for any time, you've seen me do conversations with others about shows I've been to. Vinyl Richie and I, who has a channel on here, did a comparison of our 10 of our favorite shows. Him being from Southern California, me in San Francisco and the Bay Area. I've done it with Jazz Shit Brooks, some great shows from the 70s. And this, I've been fortunate enough, the right time, the right place growing up, and to see so many shows at venues as infamous as the Fillmore West in San Francisco, the Winterland, the Fillmore Auditorium, when it kind of reopened again, the old Waldorf, Wolfgang's, the Great American Music Hall, the Boarding House, also punk clubs like the Def Club, Mabuhay Gardens down to LA, to some down there as well, and around the country, CBGB's I've been to twice. I feel very fortunate to have seen some large and infamous shows. And so I picked 5, not all necessarily the best shows, but they're infamous for a specific reason, and you'll know why once you see this list. So the most recent is 20 years ago to November 29th, 2002. And that was at the Royal Albert Hall and the concert for George. This is a concert put on by George Harrison at the Royal Albert Hall. I'm going to tell stories in these videos, not just say I went to the show and move on. This is in a way like my series that I haven't done in a while, Memories of a Vinyl Junkie, where I want to share my own personal experiences. Now, in 2001, George Harrison died of cancer. And a year later, Eric Clapton put together this tribute. He curated it in a way. He arranged the musicians. And, as much as I like to rag occasionally on Clapton, he was a true lifelong friend of George Harrison's and did a magnificent job with the blessings of Olivia and Danny Harrison putting this show together. Now, I went online, I think through Craigslist, and bought a ticket from someone in the UK. And this is the ticket. This is the show I saw. This is the one-off show at the Royal Albert Hall, Friday, November 29th, 2002. 150 pounds. Now, the person, it turned out, had lived in the Bay Area, still had a bank in the Bay Area. So what I did is I deposited money in her account and then showed up literally at a cafe in London the day before the show and picked up the ticket. Is that trust or what? I sat next to her and her family, and we had 9th row, seat 32. Profits in the aid of the Material World Foundation, a foundation George started way back with Ravi Shankar, concert for Bangladesh. The concert will be filmed. Please be seated by 7:20 p.m. I flew to London. I used some miles I had for my American Express card, flew Virgin Atlantic. I got upgraded. They upgraded me. I can't remember why. So this is the first time in my life. This was, I sat in the upper part of the 747 and I spent a week in London. I had a fabulous time. I was alone and I went to this show. And what I remember, an interesting thing, I'd never been to the Royal Albert Hall up to this point. And for some reason, I was there early and there was a door that said artists. And I have photographs of that. I'm not going to show them here now, but I remember going up to the door and I had my ticket and the guy just let me in. And this was before everyone was let in at the main doors. And I don't even know why. I don't know. I didn't have any special VIP, but I walked in and this was about an hour before they let the masses in. I mean, there were people in there, so it wasn't dead quiet. And I walked around the peripheral balcony of the Royal Albert Hall and you could smell the incense. You could see the beautiful, in fact, I think this, as far as I remember, this was the image up there first, the younger George, opposed to the later, older George. And I walked into one of the bars, got a drink, and I experienced, it was kind of like the namaste moment of being in this beautiful, infamous concert hall. I've heard about so many famous shows there over the years. What an amazing place to see music. And they handed out to everyone this Concert for George booklet. This was the program. Words from George Harrison. And just simple, beautiful, in memoriam, George Harrison, Royal Albert Hall, London, England. Concert for George. Saffron. I have several projects, books, and limited editions that I got years later. This was a special edition of the Concert for George that comes in this beautiful clam shell box. A beautiful, beautiful book of photographs. Now, if you haven't seen the concert film, you owe it to yourself to see it. It's one of the most amazing experiences, one of the most amazing concerts. Now, there's two versions of the motion picture. There is the full concert with interviews and behind the scenes and everything. And I saw that in a theater when it played in a limited edition theater. And I think I've watched it only once on DVD. But the concert itself, from beginning to end, I watched maybe over 20 times now. It was such a wonderful, wonderful event. And I was in the best mood. It was actually a spiritual moment, a spiritual concert. The various LPs, the vinyl version that just came out in this special edition. And it contains the DVD in here as well. It had Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne and Gary Brooker from Procol Harum and Danny Harrison. Olivia and Ravi Shankar sat on the side of the stage. It opened up with a beautiful classical piece that Ravi Shankar composed for George Harrison with Ravi's daughter, one of his daughters, Anushka, conducting the Indian musicians. And it was so beautiful. Also, Genesis publication is limited edition, put this limited edition book out, clamshell case, and it has a reproduction, or actually another reprint of the brochure here, and this lovely, lovely Genesis book, signed by Olivia Harrison. The Concert for George. I've been going to punk shows in San Francisco probably since 1976, when I first saw the Ramones play at the Savoy Tivoli in North Beach, Upper Grant. And during 77, 78, and beyond, Brooks and I would go to the Mabuhay Gardens. We go to the Def Club. A lot of these one-off clubs that had punk and new wave type of music, mostly punk initially. The Mabuhay Gardens being the most famous. And during that time, I saw groups like the Dead Kennedys, the Avengers, the Nuns, and any of the LA bands like X that would come a little later, come through San Francisco, and obviously UK bands like The Damned, Devo, which is more on the new wave side. When they're first, before their big Warner Brothers album came out, when their singles, mostly Satisfaction and Mongoloid, were coming out. We Are Not Man, We Are Devo. But 1978 Winterland. In 1978, I was dating a woman named Nancy Newhouse, who was a disc jockey, weekend disc jockey on KSAN Radio, which was sort of the premier FM rock station in San Francisco. They came out of the ashes of KMPX that Tom Donahue started in the late 60s, the father of underground radio. And they were the first stations, and very important stations. And Nancy worked Saturday and Sunday nights at 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift, and I would hang out there occasionally, and it was kind of a fun time, obviously. Well, I went to see the Sex Pistols at Winterland. KSAN Radio broadcasts the show, so you can hear and see videos of this show. And the Avengers and the Nuns were the opening acts. The Avengers were a great band that I saw quite a bit. The Nuns I only saw a couple times, and Alejandro Escovedo was a member of it, his early kind of starting out days, who was a great sort of indie, post-punk, Americana artist to this day. I believe he's in Austin now. But this was an incredible show and one of the most disappointing shows and one of the most interesting theatrical shows. What I remember about it is they weren't very good at all. I remember about Johnny Rotten just taunting the audience like he does. If you've seen clips, pretty much any clip, he would yell at the audience, he would throw things, the audience would yell back. Typical cliche punk rock show. They weren't very good. Sid Vicious was a terrible bass player. This is my original UK pressed cover with the blank background on Virgin Records from 1977. And it turned out to be the very last concert, and Sex Pistols would implode and blow up. I don't remember it was the night before or after the show. We went back to KSAN, and Sean Donahue, son of Tom Donahue had died, 5 years earlier. Sean Donahue's son was one of the night DJs, and he was on the radio, and Sid Vicious came. And I can't remember now if it was that night or the night before. I know a couple of the Sex Pistols are on a live interview, KSAN broadcast you can find out now, and that's not the one I heard, but we were at the studio with Sid Vicious at that night, and it was, and he took calls on the air. Of course, he was swearing at everyone. He was fucked up off his ass, and it was one of the more interesting things. I didn't have any one-on-one conversation. I remember there's maybe 15, 20 people in around the studio at that time. So being in the room around the time of the Sex Pistols performing their last concert, it's one of those concerts you look back on and, oh, it's so great that you were there and you experienced it. But musically, maybe that's not the point, and obviously it's not. And I really, looking back, I'm so happy I went. And it was such a shit show. And it was the end of the Sex Pistols, Winterland, 1978. It's really interesting what you remember looking back on your life, 40 years, 50 years in some cases. We're going to go back now to 1976. 1976, of course, I was working at the record factory on Irving Street, right near Golden Gate Park, in the inner Sunset district of San Francisco. And I lived with Jashit Brooks. He was my roommate a block away on Judah Street. So it was great working at this record factory store. On the balcony, there was a mezzanine that had a used record shop, and we were downstairs. The old bank building had been a Bank of America with a large, high ceiling, so you could see up to the mezzanine, and these arch walls that had been painted with these sort of Maxwell Parrish style of murals, or actually stained glass paintings on the window of nudes, Maxwell Parrish type, and really great for San Francisco. Thing is, remember the 1970s. And then there was a downstairs that went into the basement, which we didn't really use, had the old vault. The lock had been taken off, so you can't lock anyone in. And we'd go down there and smoke pot occasionally and worked in record stores. And we heard about this concert that was coming, and it was the band final show. And it turned out to be called The Last Waltz. And it was at Winterland. And the reason to that is the band played one of their first shows in San Francisco. So they decided to start in San Francisco and end in San Francisco. And it was interesting to note that a handful of bands ended it in San Francisco, three of which, in a way, are in this video. What a coinkydink. Of course, I had seen the band 3 times before. I'd seen them in Stanford. I saw them at the Civic Auditorium the first time, and one other time, as I recall. So this is my 4th time. And it was $25 for the ticket, which was a shitload of money at that point. And my manager, Vernon, refused to pay the $25. He didn't end up going to the show. He regretted it years later, but that included a Thanksgiving dinner and surprise guests. They were not pre-announced, all the guests. Now, I think we were told that they were going to film the concert for a show. Bill Graham put this event on. The chandeliers lined the stage were from the San Francisco Opera scene department, set department, and the film was being made by Martin Scorsese. And what a night it was. Now, my parents were upset, even though I was living, my own apartment, that I wasn't coming to Thanksgiving dinner. So we did a compromise. I think I went there at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So we all missed the sit-down Thanksgiving dinner for the 4,500 or so patrons who came to Winterland. They had a sit-down Thanksgiving dinner. So we showed up as they were pulling out the table. So we didn't participate in the food. I went to my parents first, who lived about 20 minutes away from me. And then we went to Winterland. And I had been going to so many shows in Winterland. In fact, Winterland was the place I'd go to see amazing bands. And I think I did actually, there's a video I did, so search my name in Winterland, and it goes over a lot of the special shows I saw there, mostly in the 70s. And at the end of the decade, prior to the end of the decade, Bill Graham closed it down. But that night, the guests came on one by one. Paul Butterfield, Eric Clapton, Neil Diamond, Bob Dylan, Emmylou Harris, Ronnie Hawkins, who we just lost, Dr. John, Joni Mitchell, Van Morrison, the Staples. Now, okay, Muddy Waters, Ron Wood, Neil Young. Now, the Staples were not there. Either was actually Emmylou Harris. They were added on a cinema segment that was added just to the motion picture. 2 years later, this 1978, the soundtrack and the video came out, The Last Waltz, an amazing show. It was one of those highlights of my life. I remember thinking, Neil Diamond didn't really fit in. He had that blue leisure suit. The reason he was on there, it was because Robbie Robertson had produced his most recent album. And then Van Morrison was incredible. Everybody was incredible. It was their night to shine. And Dylan, of course, you always expect Dylan to show up. And of course, Dylan showed up. So The Last Waltz, one of the highlights, one of the greatest concert films of all time. And just a beautiful documentary by Martin Scorsese. This next listing, I'm sort of going to combine two. It's mainly about one show, but it's the same group, 2 different experiences I had, and it's The Who. And I really want to talk about 1973 Cow Palace show, and if you know The Who and you know their history, you know exactly which show I'm talking about. But let me go back to 1969, because the first time I ever went to the Fillmore West, which is on Market Street, it was a second location that Bill Graham called the Fillmore. The first one is in the San Francisco and Geary and Fillmore, and it's where it is today. It's returned to that venue, and that's the shows you see now at the Fillmore. That's the original Fillmore Auditorium. Fillmore West had been the Carousel Ballroom. It was above a Waters Buick car dealership upstairs that became a Honda dealership years later. And I didn't go there a lot because I was a little on the young side. My parents didn't want me to go to the shows, thinking that I was going to get stoned or someone was going to spike my drink with acid, which actually happened on occasions. But the first show I saw was The Who performed Tommy at the Fillmore West. It was one of the most amazing shows I'd ever seen. First time there. First time I ever saw The Who out of about 5 or 6 times, and it was magnificent. This is probably one of my top 3 Who albums of all time. The Who performing Tommy. But the show I really want to talk about was in November 20th, 1973 at the Cow Palace. Cow Palace is actually in Daly City, California, just on the borderline of San Francisco. Beatles performed there in 1964 or 65. Wings Over America, George Harrison tour of 74, the Dark Horse tour, amongst others. Saw Allman Brothers there on one New Year's Eve. And I saw a lot of shows there. It's not my favorite venue. I saw Neil Young there with Sonic Youth opening. It's a big cavernous spot. I think in 1960 they had the Republican National Convention there in San Francisco. Well, Daly City, San Francisco. But the Who were touring Quadrophenia. I've mentioned this. It's not my favorite Who album. I think it's overwrought. I think there's brilliance in it. A lot of people love this record. But let's talk about this show. This was the first leg of the 1973 tour. And about half hour into the tour, while they were playing Won't Get Fooled Again, Keith Moon collapses on stage, passes out. They bring him off stage, take a little break. He comes back later. I think he played a few more songs, and there's rumors at this point someone spiked his drink, that he was given elephant tranquilizers, that he had jet lag, and he went on and played a little bit longer, and then he passed out again, and they took him off, and he couldn't come back. And Pete Townsend, they tried to enlist the drummer of the opening act. I forgot who that was right now, and I think he was too scared to play, couldn't announce it. Now, I was at the show with one of my best friends named Larry Weinberg, and Larry Weinberg is a friend of mine I lost about 8 years ago, who was a drummer in my band growing up. But we were at the far end of this cavernous palace, if you will, called the Cow Palace because there are a lot of rodeos there, and which seems strange for San Francisco if you know San Francisco. But Pete Townsend asked if there are any good drummers in the audience. And I said to Larry, let's go up. And we actually started kind of moving. We just started running to the side, but we were way back. And it turned out this guy, Scott Hallen, I think that's his name, was close up, and him and his buddies had just got tickets. And Scott went up and he played with the Who for 30 minutes. He played 2 blues songs. He played Smokestack Lightning and Spoonful. And then he played an original Who song, which I think I heard, as I recall, reading later, that he had trouble with, called Naked Eye. And then they called it quits. And that was this infamous show. It was such a blunder. It was one of those shows that you just can't forget. Not a great experience. Interesting because of how infamous it turned out to be. But musically, it wasn't one of the great shows. And maybe that's part of the reason there's a bad taste in my mouth whenever I think of Quadrophenia, because I expected more and I got less. The good news, as a sort of a reprieve or a thank you or a apology or hello to San Francisco, we screwed up. I think it was 2 to 3 years later, the Who came back on doing a tour again, and Bill Graham had them play 4 shows at Winterland, and Winterland holds only less than 5,000 people. So I think that was a great thank you. We're going to play a small venue, and I saw that show as incredible. It was not like the cavernous Cow Palace. At that point, the Who were doing stadium shows and arena shows, and this was something much smaller. And so all the kudos to them, and it was great that Bill Graham had the clout and the respect of musicians to do things right, and he came back, the Who came back and performed at Winterland for smaller shows. The Quadrophenia, the Who. I was 14 years old in 1969, and I was able to do a lot, being somewhat independent for my age, but there are certain things that were off limit. Like I said, that year going to see the Who at the Fillmore West without my parents' knowledge, sort of sneaking out with friends and doing something differently. Another time was on December 6th, 1969. And I had my group of friends who we were all kind of good kids, and we had a band, and we were hanging around. We weren't into drugs or anything. And there was the Stoners, another sect or another clique of high school students that I knew. They're artsy Stoners, longer hair. I had long hair by that point, and they had longer hair. Mine was just getting a little, ducktail there, growing longer. And I don't remember exactly how. There was a guy named George, and who was an artist, an amazing artist, and a couple other people, and they convinced me to go with them to what was going to be this free concert the Rolling Stones were putting on. And that turned out to be the infamous Altamont show in Altamont Pass. That show, the concept of that show was a joint effort from the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane to do sort of a free concert, to do a Woodstock West, if you will. This was a few months after the Woodstock, happened in August of that year, and we wanted to do a West Coast version on this side of the country. They wanted to do it in Golden Gate Park, and there was, because of the Dead and the Airplane, all the San Francisco bands had done free concerts in the park over since 1967. And I attended some when I was a kid riding my bike, and that was a great way to see these shows as a young kid where I wasn't going to the venues. I could go to Golden Gate Park any weekend and see free music almost. And so the Dead, the Airplane, they came to this idea, and they couldn't get the permit for Golden Gate Park. I think that weekend, the planned weekend when the Stones would be available, there was a 49er game. At that period of time, the 49ers were playing at Kezar Stadium in Golden Gate Park, right on the corner of Golden Gate Park near the Haight-Ashbury. So then they were going to do it at Sears Point Raceway on the way to the Napa, the wine country. Before it was really the wine country as we know it today. And that got shelved because they wanted some huge insurance deposit and policy. And then wanted the Rolling Stones to foot the bill there. And so a guy came out and donated his land at Altamont Pass in the Livermore area, which is about 45 minutes to an hour from San Francisco southeast, before you hit I-5. Was I-5 even around then? I don't remember. They were building I-5 up and down. We had 101 down to Southern California. But anyway, I went with my friends to see that show, and it was billed as this concert, and it was promoted with the Grateful Dead, the Jefferson Airplane, Santana, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and the Flying Burrito Brothers. And I remember packed into this car. I hadn't gotten my driver's license yet, and some of these guys, and I think there was two girls, were a year older than me, and so they had their licenses and they were driving. And I remember being a little nervous in a little way, but we drove out there, and I just remember we had to walk a long ways to get to the venue, to get to this outdoor area, and it was a strange area. And it turned out 300,000 people ended up showing up at Altamont, and it went into the evening, and we were really far back. So the infamous story of Meredith Hunter being murdered, being knifed by a Hell's Angel. I didn't even know that happened until I got home the next day, and it was all over KSAN radio, and they had reporters talking about it. And because of this incident, the Hells Angels beat up Marty Ballin. I didn't know this at the time, but they were yelling something about, they're hitting Marty and stop this. Grace was yelling at him. I don't remember the specifics. I remember Crosby, Stills and Nash. I remember Santana. I remember Jefferson Airplane, who was my favorite of the San Francisco bands. I barely remember the Flying Burrito Brothers. Country rock was still new to me. I didn't know who Graham Parsons was, obviously. That was his last show with the Burrito Brothers. And because of this incident with the Hells Angels and Meredith Hunter and Marty Ballin, the Grateful Dead decided not to perform. So they bowed out of the whole concert that they were initially a part of. And of course, the Stones were about to tour because of this album, Let It Bleed. And I had seen them earlier this year in October at the Oakland Coliseum. So this is my second time seeing the Stones. And I don't remember it being a good experience. It was not a great experience, but I don't remember it much. I'm not sure why. I just remember, walking a long time, being stuck in traffic for hours, getting home late. I don't remember my parents' reaction at that point or where I even told them I was that day. It did turn into a film that the Maisley brothers did call Gimme Shelter, which, if you haven't seen it, it's a must because of the violence, the whole process of putting on the concert. And the connection is another connection. My friend Danny, who was in the band with Larry and I, his father was a lawyer, and he was one of the criminal attorneys that handled the Hells Angel case. And actually, the Hells Angels got off on that case. This is a result of that tour, Gimme Shelter. This is Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, one of the great live albums, and one of the great albums the Stones have ever made, in my opinion. Fantastic record. Those are the 5 infamous shows. There's so many others I could have talked about, but these are the ones that whenever I talk to someone about music and shows, they seem to garner the most interest. So hope you liked it. Any comments below? Infamous shows you've seen? I'd like to hear if you saw any of those shows. Were we in the same venue ever together? Maybe. Mazzy loves you.